The smell of burning cornbread was what undid her. Georgia Hayes stood in the doorway of her own kitchen, heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth, watching smoke curl from the cast-iron skillet like a black ribbon being pulled toward heaven. She had not moved from that spot in 3 full minutes. She had not eaten in 2 days. She had not spoken aloud to another living soul in 11 weeks, and the silence of that fact hit her now like a fist square to the sternum, because there was a man sitting at her table. Not just any man, a stranger. A big, broad-shouldered stranger with trail dust still caught in the creases of his collar and eyes the color of creek water in October, and he was sitting in the chair that had belonged to her husband, and he had not asked permission, and she had a rifle in the back room, and yet she had not moved to get it. The cornbread was burning, and somehow, impossibly, that was the thing that broke her. Not the outlaws who had burned half her South field 3 weeks ago. Not the bank letter she had opened that morning that told her she owed $640 by the 1st of September, or the bank would take everything her husband Thomas had built with his bare hands over 14 years. Not the fact that she had not slept more than 3 consecutive hours since the fever took him in the spring. The burning cornbread broke her, and she said, very quietly, almost to herself, not even really to him, because she had forgotten for a moment that he existed, "I have not had someone to cook for in a long time." And Grant Finley, who had ridden into Redemption Creek, Texas on a lame horse with $40 in his coat and a secret so heavy it had bent him sideways for the better part of 3 years, looked up from the table he had been studying with those October eyes, and he said, plain as water, "I am not going anywhere." Georgia Hayes had not expected that. She had not expected any of this. She had not expected the morning to go the way it had gone, and to understand why it mattered that Grant Finley was sitting at her dead husband's table and refusing to leave. You had to understand what kind of woman Georgia Hayes was, and what kind of morning could bring a woman like her to the edge of something she could not name. It was the summer of 1881 in Redemption Creek, Texas, a town that had been trying to live up to its name since it was founded in 1863 and had not quite managed it yet. The town sat in a shallow valley between 2 ranges of limestone hills, and in summer the heat came off those hills like breath from a furnace. There were 2 saloons, 1 church, a general store, a blacksmith, a doctor who drank too much, and a sheriff who did not drink enough to make him forget that he was afraid of the Caldwell gang. The Caldwell gang was the dark fact at the center of everything in Redemption Creek. Wade Caldwell ran his operation out of the hills to the north, and he had been collecting what he called tribute from the ranchers and farmers of the valley for going on 4 years. It was extortion dressed up in frontier language, and everybody knew it, and nobody had stopped it, because the 3 men who had tried were buried in the churchyard, and the 4th was living in San Antonio now with a permanent tremor in his left hand. Thomas Hayes had been the 5th man who tried. He had organized a group of ranchers in the winter of 1880 and written a letter to the county seat asking for a marshal. The letter had made it as far as the county seat. The marshal had written back saying he would come in the spring. In February, Thomas Hayes came down with a fever. By the time the fever broke, he was too weak to stand. By March he was gone, and the marshal had never come, and the letter was forgotten, and the ranchers who had signed it quietly stopped talking about it, because Wade Caldwell had made it known through his men that he knew their names. Georgia had buried Thomas on a Tuesday. On Wednesday she went back to work. She was 31 years old, not young, built for the kind of life she lived with a practical strength that had nothing to do with delicacy. She had dark auburn hair that she kept in a braid because there was no time for anything else, and green eyes that had seen enough of the world to know when it was being cruel on purpose. She had come to Texas from Georgia, which was where her name came from, her father's idea of sentiment. She had come at 18 to marry Thomas Hayes, who she had met exactly once before the wedding and had loved completely and without reservation for 13 years. She did not know how to be a widow. She knew how to run a cattle operation. She knew how to negotiate with buyers in San Antonio. She knew how to read weather in the clouds and how to treat a sick animal, and how to fire a Winchester with enough accuracy to be dangerous. But she did not know how to be alone, and she was discovering, at 31, in the middle of a Texas summer, that not knowing how to be alone was its own particular kind of terror. The morning that Grant Finley arrived had started badly. She had risen before dawn, as she always did, and gone out to find that 2 of her 3 remaining ranch hands had loaded their gear and left in the night. They had left a note, which was more courtesy than she had expected. The note said they were sorry, but they had families and the Caldwell gang had been by again and they could not risk it. She understood. She did not blame them. She stood in the empty bunkhouse holding the note and understood it completely, and still felt something crack open inside her chest like a dry board under weight. She had one hand left. A boy named Pete Garrison, who was 17 and loyal to a fault, and too young to know that loyalty could get you killed. She could not send him away because he would not go, and she could not keep him because she could not afford his wage, and she could not make herself ask him to work for nothing even though she suspected he would say yes. The bank letter had come on the afternoon stage, and she had read it twice at the kitchen table before folding it neatly and setting it on the shelf above the fireplace where Thomas used to put things that needed serious thought. Then she had started making cornbread because it was the only thing she could think of to do, and the grief and the fear and the exhaustion had caught up with her all at once while the skillet was on the stove, and she had just stopped moving. She had stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the front room, and the cornbread had burned, and Grant Finley had been sitting at her table. He had come to the door an hour before that. She had heard the knock and taken the Winchester from its place by the back door before answering, and when she opened the front door there he was, hat in hand, standing on her porch with a look on his face that was careful and tired in equal measure. He said his name was Grant Finley, and he said his horse had gone lame on the north road about a mile out, and he asked if he could water his horse at her trough and whether she might have worked because he was willing. She had looked at him for a long moment. He was tall, over 6 feet, with the kind of build that came from actual labor and not from vanity. He looked to be in his mid-30s, maybe 34 or 35, with a face that had been weathered into something honest by sun and wind, and whatever life he had been living before this morning. He wore a Colt revolver on his right hip and wore it like a man who knew how to use it and hoped he would not have to. "What kind of work do you know?" she asked. "Cattle work. I can break horses and mend fence and handle a team. I can track and I know tack repair and I am fair with a rifle." "Where are you coming from?" He hesitated one half beat, which she noticed. "Montana," he said. "Montana to Texas was a long road. Why Redemption Creek?" "I did not specifically aim for Redemption Creek," he said. "I aimed for Texas, and this is where the road went." She had almost told him no. She had the word formed and ready. Then Pete Garrison had come around the side of the barn to tell her that the northeast fence line had gone down in the night and there were cattle out on the Ridge Road, and she looked at Grant Finley and said, "Put your horse in the barn. The lame one gets the east stall. I will talk to you when I have handled this." She had spent the next 2 hours working fence and chasing cattle with Pete and Grant Finley, and by the time they had the fence up and the cattle back, she had watched Grant Finley work enough to know that every word he had said about his skills was true and possibly modest. She told him he could stay. She did not tell him about the bank letter or the Caldwell gang or the 2 hands who had left in the night, and she told herself she would figure out the money situation before it became his problem. And she had come inside to make cornbread and had stood in the doorway and said the thing that was truest of everything she had been feeling for 11 weeks, and he had said he was not going anywhere. Now she turned back to the stove and moved the skillet off the heat. The top of the cornbread was black. She looked at it for a moment. "I burned it," she said. "I can see that," Grant said. He rose from the table and came to stand beside her, not too close, a respectful distance, and looked at the skillet. "You have eggs in the cold box. I can scramble eggs. She looked at him. It was a strange thing, a man she had known for 3 hours offering to scramble eggs in her kitchen. You cook, she said. I have been cooking for myself for a long time, he said. I know the basics. She set the skillet in the dry sink and let him take over the stove, and she sat at the table in the chair that was hers and watched him work. And there was something about watching another person move through her kitchen, filling the space in a way it had not been filled in almost a year, that made her throat ache in a way she could not explain. He scrambled the eggs with a little salt and a little lard, and put them on the table with the bread she had made yesterday that had not burned. He poured coffee from the pot that was still warm on the back of the stove, and he sat down across from her, and he said, "You want to tell me what is actually going on with this place?" She looked at him over the coffee cup. "What do you mean? You had hands leave in the night. You are running cattle on this acreage with one boy and no help. You opened a letter yesterday and your face went to stone. And you are a woman alone on a property this size, which in my experience does not happen without a reason and usually not a good one." Georgia Hayes set her coffee cup down. The smart thing was to say nothing. The smart thing was to keep the situation professional, pay him what she owed him when she could, and keep her personal catastrophe separate from the man she had just hired. She said, "My husband died in March. The bank wants $640 by September 1st or they take the land. I have one hand left and he is 17 years old. And Wade Caldwell's men burned part of my south field 3 weeks ago because I refused to pay his tribute, and they told me the next time they would do worse." She had not planned to say any of that. It came out in a single exhale, like she had been holding it under pressure, and something had finally given way. Grant Finley did not say anything immediately. He looked at her across the table with those quiet, October eyes, and she could not read what was in them, which irritated her because she had always been good at reading people. "I am sorry about your husband," he said finally. "Thank you. How long has Caldwell been operating in this valley? 4 years. And the law? The sheriff is afraid of him. The county marshal never came. My husband tried to get help and then he died, and after that nobody wanted to try." Grant Finley nodded slowly. He looked out the window at the land beyond, the dry grass hills and the limestone ridges and the sky that was the blue of deep summer. Then he looked back at her and said, "The $640, how much of it can you raise before September?" She blinked. "Excuse me, the debt, how much can you raise, selling cattle? What does your stock situation look like?" "I have about 40 head of longhorns ready for market. If I can get them to San Antonio without losing too many, I might clear 400 at current prices. That leaves 240 short." "Yes. And you know this because you have already done the arithmetic 17 times. Probably closer to 40 times," she said. Something shifted in his expression, the smallest thing, like a door opening a crack to let light through. It might have been respect. She was not sure. "What will you take as my wage?" he asked. "I can offer you room and board and $30 at the end of the month," she said. "And I will be honest with you that I do not know with certainty that I will have the $30. Room, board, and 20, he said. "Keep the other 10 toward the debt." She stared at him. "You do not even know me." "I know enough," he said simply, and picked up his coffee cup. This was the beginning of something Georgia Hayes had no name for yet, and she was too practical and too exhausted and too careful to let herself wonder what it might eventually be called. The first week was work. That was the only word for it. Georgia and Grant and Pete Garrison rose before dawn every morning and worked until it was too dark to see. And Grant Finley earned his wage 20 times over in that first week, and did not mention it. He had ridden out the morning after his arrival to collect his horse from where he had left it on the North Road, and the horse was a good animal, a strong bay quarter horse he called Cedar, and he had worked it back to soundness in 4 days with careful treatment and patience. He was patient in a way that Georgia had not expected. She had expected something more aggressive from a man his size with a gun on his hip, but he was quiet and methodical, and he thought before he acted. And when she gave him direction, he followed it without argument, and then sometimes, after she had stated her position, would say, "Have you thought about doing it this way instead?" and describe an alternative that was usually better than her plan. She said yes to his alternatives 3 times in the first week and pretended on each occasion that it had been a close call when it had not been. Pete Garrison liked him immediately, which Georgia took as a good sign. Pete was a good judge of character in the way that young people sometimes were, before the world taught them to be cautious. Pete followed Grant around asking questions about Montana and about cattle techniques and about tracking, and Grant answered everything with the patient thoroughness of a man who did not consider any question beneath him. On the 5th evening, Georgia found Grant sitting on the porch steps as the sun went down, cedar tied at the rail, and she brought 2 cups of coffee out and sat in the chair beside the steps and handed him one without asking if he wanted it, because it seemed obvious that he did. "Tell me about Montana," she said. He took the coffee and looked out at the darkening hills. "What do you want to know? You rode from Montana to Texas. That is a significant distance to cover. Most men come to Texas for a specific reason." He was quiet for long enough that she thought he was not going to answer. The fireflies were beginning to come up out of the long grass, and somewhere across the valley a coyote made its evening statement to the coming dark. "I had a partnership that went bad," he said finally. "Cattle operation in the Yellowstone Valley. My partner and I built it from nothing over 8 years. And he had a hidden motive I did not see until it was too late. He had been selling cattle that were not his to sell and using my signature on the bills of sale, and when it came apart in my direction." Georgia looked at him. "Were you cleared?" "Eventually. It took a year and a fair amount of money and a lawyer in Helena who believed me, which was lucky. But by the time it was cleared up, the operation was gone and my partner had taken what remained and left for parts unknown, and I had a reputation in Montana that was going to follow me regardless of the court's verdict." He paused. "So I went south." "That is a dark past to be carrying," she said. He looked at her then directly, and she held his gaze. "Everyone in this country is carrying something," he said. "You learn to carry it without letting it bend you." She thought of Thomas. She thought of the empty chair at the kitchen table and the sound of his boots on the porch that she still woke up expecting to hear some mornings. "Yes," she said, "you do." They sat in the quiet for a while after that, and it was not the silence of 2 strangers who did not know what to say. It was the silence of 2 people who had said enough for one evening and were content to let the dark come in gently. It was on the 8th day that Wade Caldwell's men came back. There were 3 of them, and they rode up to the house in the mid-afternoon on horses that had been well treated, which Georgia had always noted as an irony about men who treated people badly. The leader was a man named Dorsey, big and blunt-faced, who had come before, and whom Georgia had refused before. He had a kind of flat confidence about him, the confidence of a man who had never really been told no by anyone who had the ability to make it stick. Georgia came off the porch to meet them. She did not take the Winchester because she had learned that taking the Winchester to this kind of meeting only escalated it into a different kind of meeting, and she was 3 against 1. She was not 3 against 1 today. Grant Finley came around from the side of the barn as the riders pulled up, and he positioned himself 8 feet to George's left without being asked, with his right hand loose and close to the colt on his hip, and his posture said nothing threatening and communicated absolute danger regardless. Dorsey looked at him with the calculating look of a man adjusting his mental arithmetic. "Who is this?" he asked Georgia. "My ranch foreman," she said. "You did not have a ranch foreman last time I was here." "Things change," she said. "What do you want, Dorsey?" "You know what I want, Mrs. Hayes. Mr. Caldwell wants his payment. You are 3 months behind." "I do not owe Wade Caldwell anything," she said. She had said this before. She planned to keep saying it. "What you call a payment is extortion, and you know it, and I will not pay it." Dorsey looked from her to Grant and back. "Your husband felt that way, and your husband is in the churchyard," he said, and it was a deliberate cruelty, the kind meant to break something. Georgia felt something go cold in her chest. Before she could speak, Grant Finley said, in a voice so calm it was almost conversational, "That comment was a mistake." Dorsey blinked at him. "Are you threatening me, friend?" "I am not your friend," Grant said pleasantly, "and I am not making a threat. I am identifying a tactical error. You came here to intimidate this woman into compliance. Reminding her of a grief that has also made her angry is not likely to produce compliance. It produces the opposite." Dorsey stared at him. The two riders behind him shifted on their horses. Grant did not move at all. "Tell Caldwell," Georgia said, "that the answer is no. It has always been no. The answer will continue to be no. And tell him that if his men come onto my property again, I will write a letter to the Texas Rangers, and I will not stop writing until someone comes." Dorsey looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Grant Finley again, and something in the arithmetic shifted, and Dorsey pulled his horse's head around and rode back the way they had come, and the two riders followed. Georgia stood still until they were out of the yard. Then she let out a long breath. "He will come back," Grant said. "I know. And next time he will bring more men." "I know that too." Grant turned to look at her. "Did you actually write a letter to the Rangers?" "My husband wrote one. It did not produce results." "I know a Ranger," Grant said. "In Austin. We rode together for a season in '77. His name is James Wheatley. He is the kind of man who does not let things go." Georgia looked at him. "You rode with the Rangers. As a civilian contractor. It is a long story." He paused. "I can write to him. It may or may not help, but it is worth the attempt." "Why would you do that?" she said. "This is not your fight." He looked at her with those October eyes, and she felt something move through her that she had no business feeling for a man she had known 8 days. "I told you I was not going anywhere," he said. That was not a polite figure of speech. She went inside and started supper, and she did not look at him again until it was ready, because she needed the time to get her expression into an order she was comfortable with. The weeks that followed built something between them slowly and carefully, the way a house is built, one deliberate piece at a time. They worked side by side every day, and the work itself was its own kind of conversation. Georgia learned that Grant was meticulous about tools, that he hung them back in their precise places after every use and hated to find them missing. She learned that he woke before 4 in the morning, before even she did, and that she would sometimes come into the kitchen at first light to find the coffee already made, and the stove already warm, and him sitting in the chair by the window reading whatever book was within reach. He had found a volume of Shakespeare's plays on her shelf that had been Thomas's and had gone through it twice. She found herself cooking with more care. It happened without her deciding it. She began to think, when she was choosing what to make, about whether it was something he would like, and then she would catch herself thinking this and feel a complicated heat in her face and put the thought away like an inconvenient document. But the thinking kept happening. She made a beef stew one evening with dried peppers from her garden, and he had 3 servings without comment, but with the look of a man experiencing something unexpected and pleasant. And she had to focus very hard on her own plate for the remainder of the supper to avoid revealing that she had noticed. Pete Garrison noticed everything and had the wisdom of 17 years and the discretion of absolutely 0 years. And one morning when Georgia and Grant were both in the barn and Grant had gone to the tack room, Pete sidled up to Georgia and said, with the directness of the terminally perceptive, "He likes you." "He likes being employed," Georgia said, not looking up from the bridle she was mending. "He watched you walk back to the house last night for about a full minute," Pete said. "Go check on the cattle, Pete." "I am just saying." "Pete." Pete went to check on the cattle, satisfied in the way of someone who has lobbed a stone and heard the distant splash. Grant Finley had indeed been watching Georgia Hayes. He was not ready to say so to anyone, including himself, in any terms that involved the word watching in that particular context. He told himself he was observant by nature, which was true. He told himself that Georgia Hayes was an unusual woman, and unusual people naturally drew the eye, which was also true. He told himself that Whatever he was feeling was gratitude, because she had given him a roof and work at a time when he had needed both, and gratitude was a respectable feeling that he could examine without discomfort. He had stopped being able to tell himself any of this convincingly around the end of the second week, when he had come in from a long day to find her at the kitchen table with the bank letter spread in front of her, and a sheet of paper and a pen and her arithmetic laid out in columns that did not add up no matter how many times she arranged them. And she had looked up when he came in, and for just a moment, before she reassembled her composure, he had seen what was underneath it. She was frightened. Not in the way of a woman who was weak, because Georgia Hayes was not weak in any particular, but in the way of a person who has carried something very heavy for a very long time and is beginning to feel the weight in the bones. She was frightened of losing this land, which was her home and her history, and the last real thing Thomas had left her. She was frightened of failing. He sat down across from her without being asked. She pushed the arithmetic toward him without preamble. They sat together for 2 hours going over the numbers, and by the end of it they had a plan. The cattle drive to San Antonio was the centerpiece. Grant knew a buyer named Harlan Reeves who operated out of San Antonio and who paid fair prices without demanding the kind of patience that auction markets required. Grant would write to Reeves and propose a private sale of Georgia's 40 head. If they could clear $420 with the savings Grant had been putting aside from his reduced wage, and with a small amount Georgia had in reserve that she had not mentioned because she was saving it for a genuine emergency, they might make the full $640. Might. It was not a comfortable margin. "What if we come up short?" Georgia said. "We deal with that when we know we are short," Grant said. "Not before." She looked at him across the table. The lamp was between them, and the light it made was warm and close. "You are not the kind of man who worries," she said. "I am precisely the kind of man who worries," he said. "I have just learned that worrying in advance of the facts is a waste of good energy." "Where did you learn that?" "From a man in Helena who had nothing left and built it back and seemed genuinely unbothered by the process. I asked him once how he managed to stay so calm, and he said worrying about tomorrow just meant you were bad at dealing with today." Georgia smiled. It was the first full smile he had seen from her, and it changed her face in a way that hit him somewhere between the ribs. "That is sensible," she said. "He was a sensible man," Grant said, and made himself look back at the arithmetic. He wrote to James Wheatley the next day. He wrote to Harlan Reeves the day after. Then there was nothing to do but wait for the mail and work, and he was good at both. Grant Finley had a secret he had not told Georgia Hayes, and the longer he did not tell it, the more it pressed on him. It was not the Montana business, which he had told her in outline. It was something more immediate and more dangerous and more directly relevant to her situation. He knew Wade Caldwell, not well, not in the way of friends or Confederates. He had crossed Caldwell's path in the spring, coming down through the Oklahoma Territory at a way station town where Caldwell and 2 of his men had been passing through in the other direction. They had played cards together one evening, the kind of forced sociability that happened in small way station towns because there was nothing else to do. Caldwell had talked. Caldwell was the kind of man who talked when he felt safe, and he had felt safe in that way station. And Grant had listened with the kind of careful attention that he had developed over years of needing to understand people quickly. Caldwell was not simply a thug who had fallen into extortion as an opportunistic crime. He had a plan. He had been systematically driving out the landowners in the Redemption Creek Valley for 2 years, buying up their properties at distress prices through a land company he operated under a different name. He had, as near as Grant could figure from what Caldwell had let slip over cards and whiskey, already acquired 4 properties in the valley. He wanted the Hayes property specifically because it sat on the best water access in the valley, a spring-fed creek that Thomas Hayes had cleverly diverted to water his stock, and whoever owned that water in a Texas summer owned considerable leverage over every other operation within 10 miles. Caldwell was not trying to get paid. He was trying to break Georgia Hayes until she sold. Grant had ridden into Redemption Creek intending to pass through, and then he had stopped because a man did not come across a situation like this one and ride past it. That was the truth of why he had knocked on Georgia's door. The lame horse was real, but he could have found help elsewhere. He had knocked on her door because he had known whose door it was, and he had known she was in danger, and he had not been able to make himself pass it by. This was the thing he needed to tell her, and this was the thing he had not told her, because he did not know how to explain it without making it sound like the first days of their acquaintance had been a kind of deception, which was not true but would look that way when laid out plainly. He told her on a Sunday evening, 3 weeks after his arrival, sitting on the porch after supper. He laid it out from the beginning, the way station, the cards, the things Caldwell had said, the land company, the water access. He told it plainly and without softening it, and then he stopped talking and let her have the silence. Georgia sat very still for a long time after he finished. The evening was settling into purple around the hills, and the first stars were coming out, and a whippoorwill was making its case from the tall grass by the dry creek bed. "You knew," she said, "when you came to the door. I knew you were a target. Why did you not tell me?" "Because I did not know how to tell you without making it sound like I came here under false pretenses." "Did you?" He looked at her directly. "I came here because a woman was in danger from a man I had specific information about. My motives were straightforward. My method of arriving was honest. I have a genuinely lame horse and I genuinely needed work. What I did not tell you was the reason I chose your door specifically." She was quiet. He let the quiet stand. "The land company," she said finally. "Do you know its name?" He called it Continental Holdings. He said it was registered in Austin. "And the 4 properties he has already taken. Who were they?" He mentioned a family named Birch, and a man named Souther, and a widow named Prentice. The 4th he did not name. Georgia's jaw tightened. She knew the Birches. They had sold up in December and left for her mother's family in Louisiana. She had thought it was grief they were running from, the death of the Birch son in a riding accident. She thought now it was possible the accident had not been an accident. "This is worse than I thought," she said. "Yes," Grant said. "I think it is." She stood up from the porch chair and went to the railing and put her hands on it and looked out at the dark hills. He watched her from where he sat, watched the set of her shoulders, the way she held herself even now, even under the weight of this new and heavier version of what she already knew. "Are you angry with me," he said, "for not telling you sooner?" She turned around. "Yes," she said. "But I understand why you did not, and the anger is smaller than the other thing." "What other thing?" "Gratitude," she said. "That you came at all." He stood up. He was not sure why he stood up. It was not a situation that required standing, but he rose and they were close together then in the narrow space of the porch, and the darkness made the moment both easier and more dangerous. He said, "Georgia." It was the first time he had used her name without the formal address of Mrs. Hayes, and the sound of it, just her name, just Georgia, in his quiet and deliberate voice, did something to the air between them that she felt with her whole body. "Grant," she said, and it was partly his name and partly a warning and partly something else. He stepped back. "Forgive me," he said. "There is nothing to forgive," she said. She sounded steadier than she felt. "Good night, Grant." "Good night," he said. She went inside and he stayed on the porch for a long time looking at the hills, and neither of them slept as well as they might have. The reply from James Wheatley came on a Thursday, 12 days after Grant had written. It was brief and it was promising. Wheatley wrote that he had heard about the situation in the Redemption Creek Valley in a general way, and had been looking for an avenue in, and that Grant's letter had provided it. He said he would be in Redemption Creek by the end of August with 2 other rangers. He said they needed whatever documentation could be gathered about Caldwell's land company dealings, the pattern of extortion, and any criminal acts that could be tied specifically to Caldwell or his men. Grant brought the letter to Georgia at breakfast. She read it twice and set it down and pressed her hands flat against the table. "He is coming," she said. "He is coming. The end of August. That is 3 weeks. We need to keep the pressure off until then, Grant said. Caldwell cannot know. He will know when they arrive. Yes, but if he does not know before they arrive, we have the advantage of timing. Georgia poured coffee. Her hands were steady. She was the steadiest person he had ever known, and it seemed to him that her steadiness was not the absence of emotion but rather the management of it, a continuous act of will that had become so habitual it looked like calm. Pete cannot know, she said. Not because I do not trust him, but because he talks. Agreed. She looked at him. 3 weeks. We can hold 3 weeks, he said. The reply from Harlan Reeves came 2 days later, and it was better than they had hoped. Reeves offered $450 for the 40 head if they could be delivered to his yard in San Antonio by the 1st of August. That gave them just under 2 weeks to drive the cattle 200 miles. It was possible. It would be hard, but it was possible. 4 of us, Georgia said, counting. You, me, Pete, and we will need one more. There is a man in town, Grant said. Jim Colby. He runs the livery. I spoke with him last week, casual conversation, and he mentioned he had done cattle work before and was looking for extra income. Jim Colby is 50 years old, Georgia said. Jim Colby has 50 years of experience, Grant said, and he can be trusted. He has his own reasons to want Caldwell gone. Caldwell's men burned his fence twice. She nodded. Talk to him. Grant talked to Jim Colby, who agreed immediately and said he had been waiting for someone to do something useful for 2 years. He was a compact, weathered man with a gray mustache and hands like worn leather, and he sat his horse with the ease of someone who had been doing it since before most current residents of Redemption Creek had been born. They left for San Antonio on a Monday morning before the sun was up, 4 people and 40 longhorn cattle, and the drive south was 4 days of the specific and demanding labor that cattle work required. The first day was the worst, because 40 longhorns have their own ideas about direction and communal destination, but by the second day, the animals had settled into the rhythm of movement, and the days became manageable if exhausting. At night, they camped and Georgia cooked over the fire, and there was something about the firelit openness of the trail that was different from the guarded evenness of the ranch house, something that allowed a different kind of conversation. Pete and Jim Colby went asleep early after the first day, worn past the point of conversation, and Georgia and Grant sat by the dying fire and talked. She told him about Thomas. She had not talked about him, really talked about him, since the funeral because there was no one to talk to who had known him, and no one she trusted enough to open that particular door. She told Grant about how Thomas had been funny in a dry, unexpected way, and how he had loved the land with the passion of a convert, which was what he was, a city man from Memphis who had come west for reasons he never fully articulated, and had found the land and recognized it immediately as the place he was supposed to be. She told him about the way Thomas had held her hand when they argued, not out of sentiment, but because he said it was harder to stay angry at someone when you were touching them, which was probably medically inaccurate but anecdotally true. Grant listened to all of it, and he listened in the way that he did everything with his full attention without hurrying her toward or away from any part of it. You loved him very much, he said. I did, she said. I still do. That does not stop. No, he said. I know it does not. She looked at him across the fire. Have you lost someone? A long time ago, he said. Her name was Ellen. We were going to be married. She died of typhoid in the summer of '73. I am sorry, Georgia said. We were young, he said. Not that it makes it smaller, but I have had a long time to carry it and find the shape of the carrying. Georgia looked into the fire. Does it ever stop being the thing that you reach for first in the morning? That first moment when you wake up before you remember and then you remember. He was quiet for a moment. It stops being every morning, he said, and then it stops being every week. And eventually it becomes something you carry that does not have to be carried consciously. It is still there. It is always still there, but it does not have to be the first thing. How long did the every morning part last for you? About a year, he said. She nodded. She was at month 5 with Thomas, and she found in his answer both truth and a kind of distant comfort, a promise that the weight would shift even if it would not disappear. They reached San Antonio on the 4th day in the early afternoon, dusty and tired, and with all 40 head intact. And Harlan Reeves met them at his yard and counted the cattle and wrote a bank draft for $450. And Georgia folded it and put it in the inside pocket of her jacket. And she stood in Reeves's yard in the San Antonio heat, and she pressed her lips together and looked up at the sky and breathed. Grant stood beside her. Jim Colby had gone to find water for the horses, and Pete was leaning against the fence looking at the city around him with the expression of a boy who had never been south of Redemption Creek. "We are going to make it," Georgia said, not triumphantly, not with relief, just as a fact she was acknowledging for the first time with full belief. "Yes," Grant said. She looked at him. There was trail dust in the creases of his face, and his eyes were tired, and he looked, in this moment, in this hot San Antonio yard, like the most solid thing she had seen in a very long time, like something that would not move no matter what pushed against it. She did not say anything. She did not need to. They spent one night in San Antonio, a small hotel near the river, and Georgia sat in the room she was sharing with Pete Garrison, and she looked at the bank draft in the lamplight, and she thought about Grant Finley sitting at her dead husband's table and telling her he was not going anywhere, and she understood something that had been assembling itself in her for weeks. She understood that she was in love with him. It was not the wild-eyed, terrifying love of novels or of her early years when Thomas had been new and everything about him had been a discovery. It was the kind of love that comes from watching someone work, from knowing the particular way they take their coffee and the books they favor, and what they look like in the gray first light before the day has established itself. It was the love of recognition, of seeing someone and knowing them, and it was the quietest and most serious kind. She put the bank draft in her jacket and blew out the lamp and lay in the dark, and felt the seriousness of it like a stone in her hand, turning it over. She was not ready to say it to him. She did not know if she would ever be ready, because saying it would change something, and changed things could not be returned to their original shape, and she was not sure she could afford another irreversible thing. But she knew it. They rode back to Redemption Creek over 2 days, and the riding was easier without the cattle. And on the second afternoon they came into the valley as the sun was making long copper shadows across the limestone hills, and Georgia saw her land laid out below them on the road and felt the complex love of it, the land and the debt and the grief and the work and all of it, mixed together into the specific weight of home. Grant rode beside her and did not say anything. He looked at the valley too, and she wondered what he saw, whether he saw it as someone passing through or whether some part of it had begun to look like something to him. She did not ask. They deposited the bank draft the following morning. Between the draft and Grant's contributed wages and George's reserve, they had $680, which was $40 more than the debt. Georgia paid the full amount at the bank and came out into the main street of Redemption Creek and stopped on the boardwalk and stood in the sun with $40 in her hand, and the deed to her land safe in the bank's confirmation receipt. Grant came out behind her and she turned and held up the $40. "Left over," she said. He smiled. It was a full smile, not the careful partial ones he usually produced, and it did things to his face that she was not prepared for. "You should keep that," he said. "I am going to buy food," she said. "Real food. And I am going to cook a meal that is not trail rations or burned cornbread, and you and Pete and Jim Colby are going to eat it." "That sounds like an excellent use of $40, he said. She bought food in the general store with the focused pleasure of a woman who had been subsisting on necessity for months, and that evening she cooked in the way she had not cooked since Thomas was alive, since there had been someone to cook for and reason to take the extra time. She made a slow-braised beef with onions and garlic and dried peppers. She made fresh biscuits and creamed corn from the garden and a dried apple pie using the last of her preserves. Pete and Jim Colby ate with the unrestrained enthusiasm of people who have been in the field for a week. And Jim Colby said it was the best food he had eaten since his late wife passed 6 years ago. And Pete said it was the best food he had eaten in his entire life, which was 17 years of food, so that was something. Grant Finley ate everything she put in front of him, and afterward, when Pete and Jim had gone out to the porch, he helped her carry the plates to the dry sink, which no one had ever done before in her kitchen, and he said quietly, so it was just between them, "Georgia, thank you." "For supper," she said. "For trusting me," he said. "In the beginning. When you had no reason to." She looked at him, this man she had trusted and argued with and worked beside and known now for over a month. This man who had written to a ranger on her behalf and contributed his own wages to her debt and told her the truth about Caldwell, even when the truth was complicated, and who had sat by the fire and listened to her talk about Thomas without once making her feel like grief was an inconvenience. "You made it easy," she said. The moment stretched. She could see him deciding something, the working of it visible in the stillness of him, the way he went very quiet when something was important. "I need to tell you something," he said. "All right. I have been thinking about what comes next, after the Rangers come and Caldwell is dealt with, what you do, what I do. And I do not want to leave," he said. It was plain and direct and very like him. "I want to stay here and work this land and help you build it back, not as an employee." He paused. "I am asking if that is something you would want." Georgia Hayes looked at Grant Finley across the kitchen that had been empty and was now full of the smell of good food and the lamp making a warm circle between them. "I think," she said, "that we should see what happens with the Rangers first, and then I think we should have a longer conversation." "That is not a no," he said. "No," she said, "it is not." He went to bed, and she finished cleaning the kitchen, and the kitchen had never felt so full of something invisible and good. James Wheatley arrived on the 27th of August, 4 days before the bank deadline, which was already resolved, with 2 rangers named Collins and Abernathy who had the efficient look of men who dealt in facts and outcomes. Wheatley himself was a lean, gray-eyed man of about 40, who had the quality of complete and unhurried confidence that the best lawmen developed over time. And he and Grant shook hands on the porch with the warmth of men who had trusted each other in difficult circumstances before. Georgia laid out everything she had. Grant had been compiling it for weeks, not obviously, carefully, gathering facts and dates and conversations documented in writing. He had spoken to the Birch family's neighbor, who had witnessed Caldwell's men at the Birch property in the days before the family sold. He had found the record of Continental Holdings in the county records in San Antonio, which he had checked while they were there for the cattle sale, and confirmed it was registered to a man named Caldwell under an alias. Jim Colby had statements from 3 other Valley residents who had received what amounted to written demands for payment, which were important because written demands left paper. Wheatley went through it all methodically and said it was more than sufficient. He said the land fraud element, the systematic acquisition under a false identity, was federal territory and would bring the full weight of federal jurisdiction behind it. He said Wade Caldwell would be arrested within 48 hours. It took 36 hours, not 48. Wheatley and his rangers rode out to Caldwell's operation in the hills on the morning of the 29th, and they came back with Caldwell in irons and Dorsey, and 2 others beside him. The remaining men of Caldwell's operation scattered into the territory and were not seen again in the valley. Georgia stood on her porch and watched them bring Caldwell through town on the way to the county jail, and she felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled since February. Not triumph, exactly. Something quieter, the kind of resolution that is not sweet but is real. Grant stood beside her. He reached out and put his hand over hers on the porch railing, just that, just his hand over hers, and she turned her hand palm up and held his. It was the first time they had touched beyond the ordinary accidental contacts of working alongside someone, and it was very deliberate and it mattered. Wade Caldwell was tried in Austin in October of 1881 and convicted on 11 counts of extortion and 3 counts of land fraud, and was sentenced to 12 years in the state penitentiary at Huntsville. Dorsey received 7 years. The land company was dissolved, and the properties Caldwell had acquired through it were returned to their proper owners, which meant the Birch family and the others, though the Birches stayed in Louisiana and sold their returned land legitimately. Georgia read about the conviction in the newspaper that came on the Thursday stage and read the relevant sections aloud at the supper table where Grant and Pete and Jim Colby, who had become a regular presence at the supper table over the preceding weeks, listened in silence until she finished. Jim Colby said, "Good," Pete said. "What will happen to his horses?" Which was very Pete. Grant looked at Georgia across the table, and something passed between them that had no need of words. After supper, when Pete and Jim had gone and the dishes were done, they sat on the porch in the cooling October air, and it was different from all the other times they had sat on the porch because everything was different now. The immediate crisis was over. The land was safe. The debt was paid. The villain, to use the simplest word for the thing, was in prison. The extraordinary circumstances that had made Grant Finley's presence both necessary and complicated had resolved, and what remained was 2 people on a porch in the dark with everything that had accumulated between them over 4 months of genuine and tested proximity. "You said we would have a longer conversation," Grant said. "I did," Georgia said. "I would like to have it now if you are willing." She was quiet for a moment, gathering what she wanted to say into its proper shape. She was a precise woman, and she was not going to be imprecise about this. "I am not the same person I was when Thomas was alive," she said. "I do not know if that is good or bad. It is just true. I have been alone for 8 months, and what you are alone with in 8 months changes you in ways you cannot always account for." "Yes," he said, "and I have been afraid for most of those 8 months that everything Thomas and I built would be taken away, and that fear has been a constant presence. It colored everything, including the first weeks of knowing you. I understand that. What I am saying," she said, "is that I want to be clear about what I feel now, separate from the fear and the crisis and the relief of it all being over. I want to be sure I am telling you something true and not just something that the circumstances created." He waited. "I am sure," she said. "I have been sure for a while. I love this land and I love Thomas, and Thomas is gone, and those things are all true simultaneously. And you are the first person I have met since he died who made me feel like the world was not entirely made of weight." She paused. "I love you," she said. "That is the longer conversation." Grant Finley sat still for a moment, and then he did something she had not seen him do before. He pressed his forehead into his hands for just a second, a single unguarded motion, and then looked up and looked at her, and his expression was so open and undefended that she felt the intimacy of it like something physical. "Georgia," he said. "You do not have to if you are not. I am not asking for. I simply wanted to be honest, the way you have been honest with me, and if—" "Georgia," he said again, interrupting the cascade which required interrupting because Georgia Hayes, when nervous, was capable of producing impressive quantities of words. "I have been in love with you since about the 3rd week. I am in love with you. I am going to stay in love with you. This is not a complicated question for me." She stared at him. "The 3rd week." "Possibly earlier," he said, "but I was certain by the 3rd week. You did not say anything. You had approximately 14 ongoing emergencies." She laughed. It came out before she could moderate it, a real laugh, and she pressed her hand over her mouth. And he was smiling, that full smile, and the porch and the October night and the sound of it all felt suddenly and entirely like the beginning of something rather than the aftermath of something else. He reached over and took her hand and held it properly this time, not the supporting gesture of before but the intentional hold of a man who meant it. "I want to stay," he said, "here, with you. I want to work this land with you and build what comes next, and if you will allow me, I would like to court you properly. Because you are the kind of woman who deserves proper, and I am the kind of man who intends to provide it." "Court me properly," she repeated. I realize that is perhaps an old-fashioned phrase. I mean, I would like to proceed with honesty and intention, and without rushing you into anything before you are ready for it." She looked at their joined hands, and she thought about Thomas, and she gave him the respectful moment of thought that he deserved. And then she looked at Grant Finley and said, "I appreciate the proper, but I am 31 years old and a widow, and I have known you for 4 months under circumstances that are the equivalent of knowing someone for 4 years. I do not think we need to be excessively slow about it." He raised an eyebrow. "Define excessively slow." "I think," she said, "that spring would be a reasonable time to be married if you are asking that question, and I believe you are." He looked at her very steadily. "I am," he said. "I am absolutely asking that question." "Then the answer is yes," she said, "with pleasure." He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to the back of it, a gesture so old-fashioned and so sincere that she felt it travel up her arm and into her chest like warm water. Then he looked at her over her hand and said, "I am going to stop being restrained now, if you do not object." "I was wondering when that would happen," she said. He leaned across the space between the chairs and kissed her, not tentatively but certainly, the way a man kisses a woman when he has been waiting long enough and has been given the clearest possible permission. And she kissed him back with everything she had, and the October night was around them, and the stars were out, and the valley was quiet, and at peace for the first time in years. They were married in the Redemption Creek Church on the 15th of March, 1882, which was a Saturday and a clear day with a sharp blue sky, and a warm wind coming up from the south that smelled of approaching spring. The church was small, and the congregation was everyone Georgia knew in the valley plus James Wheatley, who had ridden down from Austin specifically, and Jim Colby, who stood up for Grant, because when they asked him, he had gotten a pleased, complicated look on his face and said he would be honored. Pete Garrison, who had turned 18 in February and was therefore technically Georgia's only adult employee, wore his best shirt and spent the ceremony looking like someone trying very hard not to cry. Georgia wore a dress she had remade from her original wedding dress, which had been her mother's, altered and freshened into something that was both honoring the past and deliberately new. She wore her hair loose, which she never did, because Grant had once mentioned with studied casualness that he thought she had beautiful hair, and she had filed that information away and taken it out for this occasion. When she walked to the front of the church and took Grant Finley's hand and they stood before the minister together, she felt the dual truth of the moment, the grief of Thomas that did not disappear and the love of Grant that was absolutely present, and she understood that these things lived beside each other in her chest without diminishing one another, and she was grateful for both. The minister spoke the words. They spoke theirs back. When he said Grant might kiss his bride, and Grant did, quietly, and with all the intention she had come to expect from him, the gathered residents of Redemption Creek made the particular kind of noise that communities make when something right happens. They went home to the ranch house, which Grant had spent 3 weeks expanding before the wedding, adding a room to the east side that was filled now with new light, built with his own hands and Pete's dubious assistance and Jim Colby's expert carpentry advice. He had built the room without being asked because it needed to be done, and because he was a man who did what needed to be done, and Georgia had watched the room go up with her heart doing complicated things that she had given up trying to manage. The wedding supper was at the house, the 4 of them, and Georgia cooked. She cooked everything good she knew how to make, the braised beef and the biscuits and the apple pie, and she cooked with joy, which was something she had not associated with cooking for a long time, and the kitchen was full of light and heat, and the smell of food and the noise of people she loved, which was all a kitchen was supposed to be. At the end of the evening, after Jim Colby had shaken Grant's hand very firmly and clapped him on the shoulder and gone to his horse, and after Pete had thanked Georgia for supper with the earnestness of a young man who had been fed well and was grateful for it, and then gone to the bunkhouse, Grant stood in the kitchen doorway watching her finish the last of the washing up. "Leave it," he said. "I will leave it," she said. "I am almost done." "Georgia." She turned around. He crossed the kitchen and took the cloth from her hands and set it on the edge of the dry sink and looked at her in the lamplight. She had flour on her sleeve from the biscuits, and there was a smudge at the corner of her mouth from the pie filling, and he reached up and brushed it away with his thumb, carefully, and she caught his hand and held it against her face. "Grant," she said. "We are married," he said, like the fact was remarkable to him. "We are," she said. "I have been wanting to say something to you since October," he said. "October. Since you told me you loved me and I told you, and then we agreed to be sensible about the timeline. I have been wanting to say it every day and being sensible about not overwhelming you with it. What did you want to say?" He looked at her, and his eyes in the lamplight were the color she had first thought of as October water and had come to think of simply as Grant. "That this is the place I was looking for," he said. "When I rode south from Montana, I did not know I was looking for something specifically, but there was a place I was moving toward, I think, and it was this. You and this land and this life. This is what I was riding toward." Georgia Hayes, who had not been a sentimental woman for a very long time, felt tears come to her eyes in the straightforward and unashamed way that genuine things produce genuine reactions. She did not wipe them away. She let him see them because he was her husband and he had earned every true thing she had. "Good," she said, "because I am not letting you leave." He kissed her, and the lamp burned, and the kitchen was warm, and outside the March wind moved across the valley that was theirs. The spring brought rain, which the valley needed badly after the dry summer, and with the rain came new grass, and the cattle had a good season on it. And by June the herd was rebuilding with the sale of 3 new calves, and the addition of a small group of stock Grant had acquired through a trade with a man he knew in Abilene. The ranch had never looked better than it did in the summer of 1882, and this was not a coincidence. 2 pairs of hands and 2 heads attending to a property made a structural difference that one person carrying everything could not replicate no matter how capable. Pete Garrison had been given a raise and a better bunk and a title, which was assistant foreman, and he had taken to this combination of improvements with the enthusiasm of a young man who had been given a reason to stay and intended to make the most of it. He had also, Georgia noticed with fond attention, begun courting the daughter of the schoolmaster, a lively girl named Alice, and could be seen making excuses to ride through town with increased frequency. Jim Colby came for supper every Sunday. This had begun as an occasional thing, and had become a standing arrangement without anyone quite formalizing it, and it was good for him, because Jim Colby lived alone in the rooms above the livery and ate whatever was easiest, which was usually not enough. Georgia cooked for 4 on Sundays, and Jim Colby ate with the pleasure of a man who was regularly reminded that meals did not have to be solitary or joyless. In September of 1882, a year after the crisis with Caldwell and 6 months into their marriage, Georgia told Grant she was pregnant. She told him in the kitchen, which was where most of the significant things in their lives seemed to happen, at the breakfast table before Pete arrived for the day's work. She had known for 3 weeks and had spent those 3 weeks being certain before she said anything, because she was Georgia and she did not speak on uncertain things. She said it plainly, directly, "I am going to have a baby in the spring." Grant looked at her across the table and went very still in the way that he did when something was important, and she watched his face, and what she saw moving across it was so unguarded and so complete that she felt it like a physical thing, the joy of it moving through him visibly, the first thing he could not contain. He was around the table before she had finished processing what she was seeing, and he pulled her to her feet and held her against him very carefully, as though she had become simultaneously precious and fragile, and she said into his shoulder, "I am not made of glass. I will not break." "I know," he said into her hair. "I know you are not." He held on anyway. She let him. Their son was born in April of 1883. On a rainy Tuesday morning that made the creek run loud and filled the new room with the particular silver light of a Texas spring rain. He was healthy and loud, which the doctor, who had mostly stopped drinking by this point, said were the two best signs. Grant was in the room for the birth, which the doctor said was unusual for a husband but which Grant had not asked permission to do, and he had been present in the way he was present for everything important, completely, unmoving, his hand in George's to be pressed hard when pressing was what she needed. They named him Thomas Grant Finley. Georgia had proposed it, and Grant had accepted it without hesitation, and the rightness of it settled over both of them like something they had known before they said it. Thomas Grant Finley was a large baby with his father's October eyes and his mother's red in his hair, and he came into the household like a fact that immediately reorganized everything around itself. And Grant Finley, who had been alone for the better part of a decade before Redemption Creek, turned out to be the kind of father who picked up the baby with a naturalness that astonished George's practical heart, as though the baby had been expected in his hands all along. Pete Garrison, who came to see the baby the morning after and stood in the doorway of the bedroom with his hat in his hands looking at the small new person in George's arms, said, "He looks like a good one." "I think so too," Grant said, standing beside him. "What is his name?" "Thomas," Georgia said from the bed. Pete nodded solemnly and understood what the name meant and said, "Good name." Jim Colby came on Sunday, as he always did, and held the baby for 20 minutes with the careful attention of a man who had not held a baby in many years, and was doing the arithmetic of what that meant. He handed the baby back to Georgia and said, "You have done well, Georgia Hayes." "Finley," she said. "Georgia Finley." He smiled into his coffee cup. "Yes," he said, "Georgia Finley." The years settled into the shape of themselves, the way good years do, not without difficulty, because nothing in the valley was ever entirely without difficulty, but with a fundamental and foundational rightness that both Georgia and Grant recognized and did not take for granted. In 1885 they had a second child, a daughter, dark-haired and fierce from the day she arrived, who they named Eleanor after Grant's mother. Eleanor was born in November with the kind of decisive energy that suggested she had a specific agenda and was annoyed at the delay of the birth process in implementing it. Thomas, who was 2.5, regarded his sister with a mixture of suspicion and captivated fascination that would define the relationship for the next several decades. Grant expanded the ranch over those years, methodically, one deliberate step at a time, buying adjacent land when it was available at fair prices from people who genuinely wanted to sell, and building the herd with the particular knowledge of a man who had learned cattle work young and loved it. By 1887, the Hayes-Finley operation, which was what the valley called it because the land had been Georgia's, and the building of it had been both of theirs, was the largest working cattle ranch between Redemption Creek and San Antonio. The town of Redemption Creek itself changed over those years, as towns did when they stopped being afraid. With Caldwell gone and the county finally functional and a proper marshal established in 1883, the valley attracted settlers who had previously passed it by. A second church went up. A school was built, which was where Pete Garrison's Alice taught the children of the valley with energetic competence, because Alice turned out to be a woman of considerable practical force, and Pete Garrison, who married her in 1884, had not underestimated her by any measure. Jim Colby remained at the livery until 1886, when he retired and moved into a small house on the edge of the Finley property at Georgia's specific invitation, because she had decided that having him within easy reach was better than having him a mile away in town. He protested that he did not want to be a burden, and Georgia had said, with the directness that was her consistent mode, "Jim, you are 61 years old and you have been eating whatever is easiest for 6 years. You are not going to burden me. You are going to come to Sunday dinner and any other dinner I decide to invite you to, and you are going to be useful with the children when I need an extra pair of hands, and that is the arrangement." Jim Colby had been out-negotiated and knew it, and was entirely grateful. James Wheatley visited in 1886, passing through on ranger business in the southern part of the state, and spent 2 nights at the ranch house. He and Grant sat on the porch those evenings and talked in the low voices of men who had history between them, and Georgia brought coffee out and sometimes joined them and sometimes did not, and Wheatley looked at the valley and the house and the children running in the yard and said to Grant on the second evening, while Georgia was inside putting Thomas and Alina to bed, "You found something here." "I did," Grant said. "Montana was a different story." "Montana was the story that had to happen so I could get here," Grant said. Wheatley raised his coffee cup. "To arriving at the right place," he said. "Eventually," Grant said, and they drank. In the spring of 1888, when Thomas was 5 and Alina was 2.5, Georgia told Grant at the kitchen table that they were going to have a third child. He received this information with the same unreserved joy that he had received the first time, which she had not expected to be consistent but which was absolutely consistent with who he was, and he pulled her to her feet and held her again, and she said into his shoulder again, "I am not made of glass," and he said, "I know," and held on anyway, and she let him, because some things between two people become their own ceremony. Their third child was a son, born in November of 1888, the biggest baby yet, who they named James after James Wheatley, because Wheatley had written to them after Alina's birth and said that if they ever had another one and needed a name, he had always thought James was underutilized, and Grant had laughed and told Georgia, and she had filed it away. James Finley arrived in the world with his father's build, which the doctor said was evident even at that stage, and his mother's stubbornness, which was also evident. Thomas, who was now 5 and fully installed in the role of eldest, took his responsibility seriously. Alina, who had always been suspicious of additions to the household, inspected the new baby with the critical eye of someone checking the quality of a purchase, and eventually allowed that he seemed adequate. On the evening of James's third day of life, after the children were asleep, and the house was quiet in the particular way that a house full of sleeping children is quiet, which is to say expectantly and temporarily, Georgia sat in the front room in the lamplight nursing the baby, and Grant sat in the chair across from her reading, which was the domestic arrangement they had fallen into over years of evenings, and the lamplight made the room warm and small. Grant looked up from the book and looked at her and the baby, and his expression was the one she had come to know better than any other over the years, the one that was entirely without the careful management he brought to the rest of his life, the one that was just him, just Grant, looking at what he had. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "That I rode a lame horse up to a stranger's door 7 years ago," he said. "Your horse was actually lame," she said. "I want to be clear that I know that." "My horse was actually lame," he said. "And I knocked on that door anyway, and you answered it with a Winchester, which is the most Georgia thing I can imagine." "I did not point it at you," she said. "You were holding it in a way that communicated you were seriously considering it." She smiled. The baby made a small, contented sound and shifted in her arms. "Do you ever think about what you were riding toward?" she said. "What you told me the night we were married, that you were riding towards something and you did not know it." "Every day," he said simply. "I am glad you knocked on my door," she said. "I am glad you did not send me away." She looked at him across the room, this man who had arrived on her porch with a lame horse and honest eyes, and had said he was not going anywhere and had meant it with every particle of himself. This man who had worked beside her and held her through grief and built this life board by board and year by year, who scrambled eggs in her kitchen and read her books and said her name the way it was supposed to sound. "Grant," she said. He looked at her. "Yes, I love you," she said. She still said it the same way she had the first time, plainly and directly, without decoration, because she had never been able to dress it up and make it more than itself and had decided long ago that herself was enough. "I love you," he said. "I am going to be here." "I know," she said, and she did know. She knew it in the bones of the knowledge, the deep, unquestionable knowing that had been built not from promises but from evidence, from 4 months of crisis and 7 years of ordinary days, and 3 children, and burned cornbread and campfires and October eyes across a breakfast table, and a man who picked up babies like they were expected in his hands, and who had knocked on her door because he could not ride past and had never once, not in 7 years, given her reason to doubt it. The lamp burned down, the children slept. The valley outside was quiet in the way of a place that had stopped being afraid, and the spring air came through the window and smelled of new grass and creek water, and the particular Texas dark that was unlike any other dark. And Georgia Finley held her youngest son and looked at her husband across the room, and knew, with the deep and settled certainty of a woman who had earned it, that she was home. In the years that followed, Thomas grew into a boy of serious purpose and his father's methodical nature, and at 10 he was already the kind of child who mended fence instead of being asked to mend it, because he had noticed it needed doing. Eleanor became exactly the force she had promised to be from the moment she arrived, opinionated and brilliant, and 6 years ahead of everyone around her in most respects, and she declared at age 8 that she intended to be a lawyer, which in 1893 was not the most obvious aspiration for a girl in Texas, but which exactly one person in her household received without surprise. That person was her mother. James grew into the biggest of the 3 children and the most gregarious, with a laugh that filled whatever room he was in, and an instinctive ease with people that Grant watched with the private pleasure of recognizing a gift he himself had not been given. James would sit with Jim Colby for hours, listening to stories about the old valley, about the days before the town had found its name, and Jim Colby, who loved the boy with the uncomplicated love of an old man for a child who wants to hear the things he has to say, told him everything he remembered. Pete Garrison and Alice had children of their own, 3 of them, and the Garrison and Finley children grew up together in the way of families who have chosen each other and made the choosing permanent. Pete had eventually taken on a foreman position at the Finley Ranch when his own small operation had been absorbed into it by a mutual agreement that made good sense, and he worked beside Grant with the particular ease of a man who had been in a place long enough that the work was part of him. The town of Redemption Creek did eventually redeem itself, by most accounts. A proper school and a real courthouse and a doctor who was genuinely sober and competent replaced the insufficient versions that had existed before, and the valley filled in with decent people building decent lives. And on Sunday mornings the church was full, and the sound of it carried across the hills that had once held Caldwell's men and now held nothing more threatening than jackrabbits. On a Sunday evening in October of 1895, Jim Colby died peacefully in his house on the edge of the Finley property, which was where he had lived for the last 9 years. He died in his chair with a book on his lap and a cup of coffee gone cold at his elbow, which was how he would have chosen to go if asked, and he was buried in the Redemption Creek churchyard in a service attended by everyone in the valley who had known him, which was everyone in the valley. Grant and Georgia sat on the porch that evening after the service and after the children had gone to bed, and it was October, which it always seemed to be when the significant things happened between them, and the air was cool and the hills were dark and the valley was as quiet as it got. "He was a good man," Georgia said. "He was," Grant said. "He was the first person I trusted here after Thomas," she said. "Before you. He was the one who kept me from feeling entirely alone." Grant nodded. He reached over and took her hand as he had taken it on the porch when they watched Caldwell go by in irons, as he had taken it 100 times in 100 kitchens and fields and evenings, and she held it the same way she always had, with her full hand and her full intention. "We should go in," she said after a while. "In a minute," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. The October dark lay over the valley that was theirs, and the creek ran somewhere in the dark, with the sound of water that had been running there longer than any of them, and would run there long after. They sat there, in the way of 2 people who have nowhere they would rather be, until the night had settled completely around them and the stars were fully out, brilliant and unchanged above the valley that had found its name at last. And then they went inside together, into the warmth and the light of the life they had built. And the door closed behind them, and the lamp in the window burned on.